Today, Holy Week opens with a drama in two acts. The first act is nothing short of triumphant and glorious. Palm fronds and branches are swayed, swished, or swooshed, as the case may be, in heartfelt welcome to the coming of the most awaited one. Men, women, and children spill out into the streets, bidding welcome to him who comes in the name of the Lord. The joyful and exultant hosannas, though, abruptly recede into the background as the drama moves into its second act. And this time around, exultant rejoicing is replaced by awed and respectful silence, as people's initial enthusiasms gives way to a more realistic appraisal of him who entered the city of Jerusalem one last time. Historically, some of those who gushed and raved as Jesus rode into town may well have cried out later for his blood, or at least watched in stony silence as he emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, coming in human likeness, becoming obedient even unto death, death on the cross. The people were right in welcoming their king. He has come after all to finally fulfill the long-awaited promises of old. But they kind of missed the bigger picture that had to do with the meaning of this integral salvation that he has come to bring. Today's second act is what this important realization is all about. It's all about joyfully joining in welcoming Jesus the Christ and singing hosannas of praise to the one who comes in the name of the Lord. But it is also about transcending initial misconceptions or misunderstandings as to who Christ was and is for us. It would do us good today to take a deeper look at him, to whom we sing hosannas to. With so many things running through our minds, and so much to do, precious little time is left for us to do any form of solid reflection on the contents of our faith. With so little reflection and careful study on the person of Jesus Christ, God and man, Savior, Redeemer, and Lord, many Christians and many Catholics get to know only partial truths about Christ. Small wonder then that, like the Jews of old, our warm and lusty hosannas can turn abruptly to cold and silent indifference, as quickly as politicians can change their loyalties to opposing political parties. Many of those who lay down their cloaks on the streets to give honor to Christ thought of him as their political savior, a Messiah endowed with earthly power and authority. Their disappointment probably gave way later to indifference to the person of him who said, "My kingdom is not of this world." Sadly, their understanding of Christ revolved around the mere satisfaction of an earthly need, the need for political salvation. In our times, there are those who subscribe to an equally less than integral image of Christ, reducing him to a mere friend, whose lordship takes a back seat, a friend who is just there to stand by us, to be with us, to journey with us. This sweet friend makes no strong moral demands, and his teaching can be summarized into what is known as the gospel of prosperity. Life for them is nothing more than an endless celebration devoid of any semblance of sacrifice. Penance and self-denial are not important. In essence, all they have is a crossless Christ whose passion and death would rather be glossed over than meditated on. They would most likely be scandalized by such movies as The Passion of the Christ and would be bored to death during the Good Friday services. On the other hand, there are those who emphasize to the neglect of others the image of a suffering Christ, for whom imitation of Christ solely means joining him in endless fasting, penance, and all sorts of bodily deprivation. The best image of the Christ they know is the suffering and bloodied Nazareno, or the Santo Sepulcro. It almost looks like the good news of the resurrection has not reached them. They go through life like as if they were programmed to be depressed, and suffering has to be welcomed with resignation, if not sought after. For them, life is nothing more, nothing less than an endless soap opera where tears abound. They have emphasized a tad too much the gospel of suffering, finding intrinsic value and goodness in suffering per se. The more suffering they can inflict on themselves, the holier they feel themselves to be, and the closer they get to the suffering Christ. There too are those who look on Christ as a punishing avenger, one whose anger at the world's sins could no longer be held back, except by our endless acts of reparation. Seen as the ultimate judge, this angry Christ needs to be appeased with endless rounds of penitential acts, year-round fasting, and ceaseless prayer. Frightened like children who have misbehaved and terrified of the dire consequences of their sins, they do not feel worthy enough to receive Christ, and so they need to do repeated acts of penance, prayerful rituals, and would go to confession every day if they could. They are a walking lesson summed up in the car bumper sticker that says, "Jesus is coming soon, and boy, is he mad." The drama in 2 acts that Passion Sunday liturgy is, puts us into the heart of a balanced acceptance and outlook on Christ our Savior, Lord, and King. Here, we find a glimpse of who He is, who He ought to be for us who believe. The first Gospel passage from Luke shows Christ as King who enters triumphantly into the city that would later condemn Him. As King, He takes possession of the city that represented the world that He was to save, a world made up of saints and sinners. But the rest of the carefully chosen readings show us how this King was to effect that work of salvation. Paul's letter to the Philippians tells us that military and political might is not the way this Savior was to follow, but the path of self-emptying and humble obedience, obedience even unto death. The other 2 readings further show us His status of exalted Savior by way of suffering and death. He redefined triumph, not in the sense of conquering opponents, but in His readiness and willingness to put down first Himself to die so that others might live. His exaltation took place by allowing Himself to be lifted up on the cross. As we open the protracted drama of Holy Week, it would do us good to check on what type of Savior we are expecting. Jesus presents Himself as our King. To Him we pledge allegiance. He also presents Himself as Savior, an exultant one, but without the usual earthly trappings of power and might. This Savior chose to follow the way of exaltation through the path of self-emptying, through the path of really accepted suffering and death, not because suffering in itself is good, but on account of a greater good, that is our salvation. As King and Savior, as Lord and Redeemer, He went to where salvation was most needed. He went to the poor, the broken, the humiliated, the distressed, the marginalized, those who are out of the loop. He went to those who suffered unjustly. He sided with those who were persecuted and those who had no one else to rely on but God, the poor of Yahweh. He made salvation happen where it was most needed. Perhaps those who cultivate an image of a Jesus that is merely sweet and kind and someone to relate to in private could be led to a more complete image of a Jesus who saves, who goes where salvation has to take place, in streets and homes, in communities where there is little love and concern for others. Perhaps, too, Those who follow the image of an angry Jesus who needs to be appeased constantly could be led to a more complete image of Jesus who wants our love and not our sacrifices. Again, those of us who are too comfortable with an image of Jesus who gives us what we ask in full measure, in cups overflowing, may be led to transform their gospel of prosperity to a gospel of social responsibility that makes the work of salvation the inclusive work that it is meant to be, which includes the less privileged and the neglected of society. Palm Sunday liturgy boils down to one important question for us. What type of Savior do we have in Jesus? And this, my dear friends, is your Kalakbay at Katoto in this Palm Sunday's reflection that we call Puso sa Puso. Happy Sunday, everybody.